All right, everyone, we're going to get started, and we're going to give our last few students a moment to get into their seats. But first, I get to offer today's welcome and introduce our speaker. Welcome to the Hinckley Institute of Politics. My name is Nicholas Cockrell. The Hinckley Institute is a nonpartisan institute here at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, and we bring in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the University of Utah's Societal Impact Seminar Series. We want to thank the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute for their leadership and partnership on this event. Today's forum is titled Economic Opportunity, Utah Insights. Now, we are excited to introduce today's Societal Impact Scholar, Dr. Raj Chetty. Dr. Chetty is the William A. Ackman Professor of Public Economics at Harvard University. He's also the Director of Opportunity Insights, which uses big data to understand how we can give children from disadvantaged backgrounds better chances of succeeding. Dr. Chetty's research combines empirical evidence and economic theory to help design more effective government policies. His work on topics ranging from tax policy and unemployment insurance to education and affordable housing has been widely cited in academia, media outlets, and congressional testimony. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 2003 and is one of the youngest tenured professors in Harvard's history. Before joining the faculty at Harvard, he was professor at UC Berkeley and Stanford University. Dr. Chetty has received numerous awards for his research, including MacArthur, Genius Fellowship, and the John Bates Clark Medal, given to the economist under 40 whose work is judged to have made the most significant contribution in his field. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chetty to our campus.
All right, thanks so much for the warm introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and have a chance to talk with you today. So I'm going to talk to you about how we can create economic opportunity and give kids, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, better chances of rising up, and focus on data from the Salt Lake City and Utah area in particular. But I'm going to start at a bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which has many different aspects to it. But one key aspect of the American dream, certainly what drew my own parents to come to this country and countless other immigrants, is the idea that through hard work, any child should have the chance to move up in the income distribution and achieve a higher standard of living than their parents did. And so in a paper my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration of being a place where kids can rise up relative to their parents by measuring the fraction of children who went on to earn more than their parents did, shown here, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And so here, is the mic still on? Are you guys able to hear me? Okay. So what we're doing here is looking at that data by the year in which the child was born, starting on the far left with kids born back in 1940, where you can see that for them it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. We estimate that 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, as you can see on this chart, there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the 1980s who are turning 30, 35 around now, when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become a 50% chance, essentially a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream of doing better than your parents. So this broad trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the American economy that we'd like to understand. I would argue it's also fundamental social and political interest because it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing. It's in places where economic mobility is lower, as measured in this way, that you have the greatest support for populist candidates in elections. And I think it underlies a lot of the tension that we're seeing in our society. So motivated by this trend, and the research group I direct at Harvard called Opportunity Insights, we are interested in studying what's driving the fading of the American dream, and more generally, what determines children's chances of rising up and how we can expand opportunities for everyone going forward. Now, our lens on studying that question is to use the tools of big data, much as you hear about big data a lot these days in the context of the private sector. We want to use large data sets to understand this question and other important economic and social policy questions. And so what I'm going to show you today is what we've learned from a series of studies about the science of economic opportunity. What is it that drives children's chances of rising up, and how we can help more people rise up in their own lives going forward. So a starting point for a lot of our analysis is to break down this national picture, to look at the data in a finer grained way. And I'm going to start by breaking down the data geographically with this map here showing you the geography of upward mobility in the United States, where I'll first take a second to describe how we construct this map and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we've done here is taken data on all children born in 1978. It's about 4 million kids. We get anonymized information from tax returns on those kids that allows us to link them back to their parents and back to the exact location in which they grew up. And then in each area, we divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas here. In each of those areas, we calculate a simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, if you grew up in a low-income family, which I'm going to define for the purposes of this talk as a family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which corresponds to an income of about $27,000 a year. So if your parents made $27,000 a year, when we look at your 1040 tax returns, when you file them when you're 35 years old, how much are you making on average? So for example, if you look at the number for Salt Lake City, we see in the data that kids who are growing up in families making $27,000 a year in Salt Lake City, they are making on average about $37,000 a year themselves when they're adults, a pretty significant amount of increase within one generation. We similarly construct that statistic for all of the metro and rural areas in the US and color the map so that the red colors are places where kids are less likely to rise up and achieve the American dream, and the green colors are places where kids are more likely to rise up. So you can see if you look at the scale on the lower right-hand side that there's a tremendous amount of variation across different parts of the US in your chances of rising up. In some parts of America, like the rural Midwest, look at a place like Dubuque, Iowa, kids starting out in families making $27,000 a year are making $45,000 or $50,000 a year in the next generation. In other places like Charlotte, North Carolina, they're actually making less than their parents were in their mid-30s, making $26,000 a year, which is kind of shocking if you think about the amount of economic growth that's occurred in the country over the past 30 years. Utah, as you can tell from this map, really stands out as a place with very high levels of economic mobility in general, among the highest in the US. Salt Lake City ranks first among the 50 biggest cities in America in terms of your chances of rising up if you grow up in a poor family. Now, when you look at this map, it's a very useful tool for multiple reasons. One is that, in a sense, it gives you a new microscope to study the determinants of economic opportunity. We can compare what's happening in Iowa, what's happening in Salt Lake City with what's happening in Charlotte or in Atlanta, and start to learn about what the drivers of economic opportunity are. It also is very useful from a policy perspective because once we have that scientific understanding, we can start to think about what kinds of policies we could implement in the redder colored parts of the map to try to increase economic opportunity there. Now, a first step in understanding the science of what's going on here is to recognize that this variation that we're seeing in this map emerges not just when we compare across regions, it's not just about differences between states or cities, it's actually something that emerges much more locally. So let's zoom in and now look at the same exact data at the neighborhood level here in Salt Lake City, where we've constructed exactly the same statistics, but census tract by census tract, neighborhood by neighborhood in Salt Lake City. And if you're interested, you can go to a website called the Opportunity Atlas and look up data for your own hometown, your own home address. You can type it in and see what economic mobility looks like there. And so, what you can see in this map is just first a very simple observation. We haven't changed the color scale, but you can see that almost the same spectrum of colors that you saw on the national map here, right here within Salt Lake City. So basically, if you go from the east side of the city to the west side of the city, on the west side, you have much poorer prospects of rising up than on the east side. It's almost like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of your chances of rising up. And so that simple point is telling you that the origins of these differences in economic opportunity, your chances of achieving the American dream, are hyper-local. It's not about differences in state-level policies or differences across cities. It's about what's happening in one neighborhood versus another neighborhood. And that might make you start to think about certain mechanisms. Maybe it's about the schools that kids are attending, who they're connected to, what kinds of local opportunities they have, and so on. And so motivated by this kind of pattern, I now want to turn to, just very briefly, give you an overview of what we and others have learned from now about a decade of research studying these kinds of data. Our team put out these sorts of data publicly about 10 years ago. Many people have since used that data to analyze what predicts these differences in economic mobility across places. So to get into that, as a first step, I'm going to go back to this map of Salt Lake City and show you analysis we did looking at kids who move between different neighborhoods, which is a way that we can learn about how this all works, what matters for generating differences in economic mobility. So rather than getting into the statistical details of the study where we analyzed 5 million children who moved across neighborhoods using tax record data, I'm going to summarize what we find in the context of a simple example. Imagine you've got a set of kids who initially, their families, they lived in West Valley City, which is in the west side of Salt Lake City, which you can see is a relatively low opportunity, low mobility area for the kids who grew up there. It's in a red color. And imagine they moved to Mill Creek, another neighborhood where you see much better outcomes for kids growing up in lower income or middle class families. So take a set of families who moved from West Valley City to Mill Creek and think about the following exercise. Imagine these families move with their kids, and the kids are of different ages. So let's start by looking at the outcomes of kids who moved from West Valley City to Mill Creek when they were exactly 2 years old. Okay, so what we're going to do in the data is follow those kids, track them over time, measure how much money they themselves are making when they're in their mid-30s. And what you can see is those kids who made this move when they were 2 years old, they're making about $36,600 when we look at their tax returns when they're in their 30s. Okay, so that's for the kids who move when they're exactly 2. Now consider exactly the same move for kids who made that move at older ages. And so kids who move when they're 3, 4, 5, and so on, from West Valley City to Mill Creek. What you see is this very clear declining pattern. The later you move from West Valley City to Mill Creek, or more generally, the later you move from a red-colored part of the map to a green-colored part of the map, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship becomes completely flat and you get no gain at all. So what do you see from this chart? I think there are 3 key insights. The first is that where you grow up, the community in which you grow up, really affects your life outcomes. So I view that as a really encouraging result. It suggests that we can take a given kid, and if we move that kid to a different neighborhood on these maps that I've been showing you, can fundamentally change that child's life outcomes. That suggests this problem is quite tractable. It's something we can actually make a change on. We don't have to look back to 1950 or some totally different country. Often the answer is a few miles down the road within your city. If you can figure out what's going on there and replicate that, you can potentially increase economic opportunity and productivity a lot. Second, what you see is what really seems to matter is the childhood environment in which you grow up, not where you live as an adult. We find here and in other studies that if you help adults move to different areas, it doesn't really do anything for their economic outcomes. It's really about moving as a kid that matters. Environment matters while you're growing up. And then finally, you see that there's what we call a dosage effect. Every extra year that you spend growing up in a better neighborhood improves your long-term outcomes. If you move to that better area when you're 5 instead of 10 or 10 instead of 15, you gain more from that additional exposure, from that additional dosage, to make a medical analogy. So given those findings, naturally, probably the next thing you're wondering about is we now know that you can produce higher levels of economic mobility if you live in one neighborhood versus another neighborhood. You're probably wondering, well, what is it that's different about West Valley City versus Mill Creek in this example? Or more generally in the maps that I've been showing you, what's different about the places where kids are doing better relative to where kids are doing worse? So there have been numerous studies written on this question using these data. I'm going to summarize what they found by pointing to the 4 strongest predictors of economic mobility that have been identified to date. The first is lower poverty rates. More mixed income communities tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. If you're living in proximity to higher income people, you tend to do better. Second, we find that places with more stable family structures, more 2-parent families, for example, tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools at both the K through 12 level and access to higher education have higher levels of economic mobility. And then finally, places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. So I want to spend an additional minute on this notion of social capital. It's something that people have talked about for more than 100 years, the idea that your community, who you're connected to, the strength of your networks might matter for outcomes. People have had that intuitive sense for a while across many different fields, but have never been able to measure social capital in any systematic way. So this is another place where big data allows us to make an advance. So after we did some of this initial work and we had a sense that social capital could be important, we set up a partnership with Mark Zuckerberg and the Facebook core data science team to use Facebook data to measure social capital with unprecedented precision, zip code by zip code in the United States. I'm going to show you here one measure of social capital that seems very relevant for economic mobility. So the map on the left on this slide is the same map of upward mobility that I showed you initially, constructed using tax data. The map on the right is a very different map. It's a map constructed using Facebook data on 72 million Facebook users between the ages of 25 and 44. That covers about 85% of the US population in that age range. That's an age range where people are still using Facebook. I know in the younger groups here, you guys are not using Facebook as much. But in that age range, lots of people are on Facebook. And so what we do is construct a simple measure of what we call economic connectedness. We're saying if you have below median income, what fraction of your Facebook friends have above median income? Just a very simple measure of how much interaction there is across class lines socially. In the map on the right, the green colors are places where low-income people have more high-income friends. The red colors are places where there's more disconnection by class, where low-income folks tend to have very few high-income friends. And you can see the result immediately for yourself. Don't need fancy statistics here. It's totally obvious that the map on the right is incredibly similar to the map on the left. The places which have the highest levels of cross-class connection are exactly the places where you have the best chances of rising out of poverty. Utah is no exception to that pattern. You can see that Utah is among the top in terms of cross-class interaction. Kids growing up or people in low-income families in Utah tend to have many high-income connections. And it's also a place, as I mentioned earlier, where you see the highest levels of economic mobility. Now, once again, this plays out not just when we look at the national level, but at a very local level. If you zoom in and look at the data in the Salt Lake City metro area, it's exactly in the communities like on the west side of the city where you see the most disconnection. You also see the lowest levels of economic mobility. So why do we see this link? We don't quite know. This turns out to be the single strongest predictor of economic mobility found to date. What exactly is going on? I think there are a couple of different mechanisms you might have in mind. One is just the simple fact that most jobs in the US are still obtained through referrals. So if you're connected to somebody who's got a high-paying job, maybe you're more likely to get an internship, you're more likely to get a job down the road that changes your own career. I think a second and deeper and probably more important mechanism is that kids' aspirations are heavily shaped by who they're around. If you've never met someone who's gone into science or business, never met somebody who's gone to college in your community, you may not think that that's really a pathway even on your radar screen. If you're in a community that's more connected across class lines, you have more connections through your church or through some other source, that ends up changing what you aspire to do, changes your life prospects. I think that's another very plausible explanation of why we see these tight connections. Whatever the reason, our sense is that this kind of social capital could be very important in terms of creating more economic mobility going forward. And so that's what I want to turn to next in the remainder of this talk before we open it up for questions. I want to spend some time talking about how you can take the research findings I've just shown you, given you a very quick overview of, how can you use that kind of information, that kind of data, to actually make policy interventions that will improve people's lives going forward, since ultimately, obviously, that's the end goal here. So the way we are thinking about this in our research group at Harvard is to focus on 3 different types of policy interventions that I think follow naturally from what I've just shown you in terms of the science of economic opportunity. So to summarize in a nutshell, what I think we've learned through many, many studies, many of which I've not talked about here, is that the roots of economic opportunity are hyper-local. It's about the exact neighborhood and community in which you grow up, from something like birth till you're 22 or 23. And what matters are things like who you're connected to, what kind of school you go to, and so on. So if you have that kind of view of the world, I think you would naturally think about 3 different ways to intervene to increase economic mobility. The first is to reduce segregation. So if I know that a few miles down the road, like on the east side of Salt Lake City relative to the west side, there are better opportunities to be had, perhaps I can help more low-income families move to these higher opportunity areas. We have huge programs in the US. We spend $50 billion a year on affordable housing programs that are intended to give families access to better neighborhoods. Maybe that's one approach to creating more opportunity. That, I think, makes a lot of sense, and I'll talk about it in more detail in a second. But of course, you can't move everyone. Not everyone wants to move to a different place. So you also have to really scale things, think about how you might bring opportunity to people where they currently live rather than move them to opportunity. And so this brings me to the second approach of place-based investment. Can you take the neighborhoods on the west side of Salt Lake City, for example, and transform them into high opportunity places? And then the third strategy is just simply recognizing that after age 18, the key touch point for most kids is not the neighborhood in which they grow up, the home in which they grow up, but rather the institution of higher education they might attend. I think there's a lot that we can do in our higher education system to make it more effective in promoting economic mobility. So what I'm going to do is spend a few minutes talking about each of these different domains, show you the kind of work we are doing, and the initiatives people are undertaking in the policy sphere to make progress in each of these areas, and then I'll wrap up. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach and go back to this map of Salt Lake City that I've shown you. What we're doing here is overlaying in the black dots the most common places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. As a bit of institutional background, we spend about $25 billion per year on the housing voucher program, which gives people rental assistance worth about $1,500 a month to find housing wherever they want. So you might notice a puzzling pattern here, which is those black dots, despite the fact that these families are getting $1,500 a month of assistance, they're all clustered in the orange and yellow parts of the map, not the green colored parts of the map, where we know from our prior work, kids are much more likely to rise up. So we're spending billions of dollars, but we're not actually helping families move to neighborhoods where you're likely to break the cycle of poverty. So why is that? When we put these data out, many people notice this puzzling pattern in housing authorities and the Housing and Urban Development Agency. And one place that approached us and wanted to partner with us on trying to figure out whether we could do something about this was the city of Seattle. This is a snapshot of the Opportunity Atlas data in Seattle, where you see exactly the same kind of pattern, lots of variation in upward mobility across different neighborhoods in Seattle. If you look at where the housing voucher holders live, they tend to be concentrated in the red-colored parts of Seattle, not the green-colored parts. So just to show you, how this kind of research can then inform policy intervention, we ended up setting up a partnership, a collaboration with the Seattle and King County housing authorities to test with a randomized trial sort of a social capital intervention to help people in the housing search process to see whether removing some of the barriers families might face in moving to high opportunity areas could change the map that I just showed you. So in particular, we took 1,000 families that came in to apply for a housing voucher. 500 of them just got the standard voucher and were just told to go look for housing with the standard protocol. The other 500 got some additional assistance. They got connected to a navigator, a counselor who helped them find housing in a high opportunity area if they wanted to do so. So they said, look, here's a set of places in Seattle where we know your kids are likely to do better. I'll help you find a listing there, go talk to the landlord with you. If you need some help with a security deposit or application fee, I'll help you out with that. Kind of somebody to shepherd you through this housing search process, which would be very unfamiliar and difficult, especially for lower income families. And so what we do is run this as a randomized trial, follow these 1,000 families over time, look at where they end up choosing to live. And here's the result. In the control group, only 14% of families end up moving to one of those green colored areas on the map that I just showed you. In the treatment group, that number jumps up to 54%, so a big shift in where families end up choosing to live. Why does this matter? So this intervention costs about $2,500 per family, providing this additional service. That's not cheap, but we estimate that the average kid who grows up just by luck in the treatment group in one of those green-colored areas, rather than in the control, is going to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes as a result of this move. So that's an incredible rate of return for that marginal $2,500 we spend to make the program more efficient. So one of the things I want to underscore here is this kind of work matters not just in terms of science and discussions in universities like this, it actually has an impact on the ground. And so to show you how that plays out, after we did that work in Seattle, there was a bill passed in Congress with a Republican and Democratic senator co-sponsoring it to authorize about $80 million to replicate what we did in Seattle in 8 other cities across America with the same randomized trial approach to basically see whether this approach would scale across the United States. And just a few weeks ago, they released the results of that evaluation, which other groups did, where they basically show something very similar to what we found in Seattle, that this kind of social support increases the fraction of families who move to high opportunity areas by about a factor of 6. So really a significant shift in where families end up moving. Given those encouraging results, there's now been another bill proposed, again with Republican and Democratic co-sponsors, suggesting or proposing a $5 billion per year increase in the allocation towards housing vouchers, allowing for these kinds of social supports, expanding the number of kids who'd be eligible, and so on. If that were to pass at some point down the road, that would really impact, thousands of kids' lives across the United States. So you can see the arc from doing this kind of basic research, trying to understand what the problems are, testing policy interventions in the field, to ultimately doing something on scale. And I think that's the vision for how I think we can make policy and do social science more effectively, given modern data. So that's one approach, reducing segregation. But it's by no means the only approach, or even I think the most important approach we should take. I think it can work on a small scale. But ultimately, we need to think about how we turn the low opportunity places into high opportunity places. That's where we can really have a scale impact. And so here again, we're at an earlier stage, but we're making some progress in figuring out how to do this. And so I want to show you a different program that the government implemented in the past called the Hope 6 Neighborhood Revitalization Program, where what they did is took 261 very high poverty, low opportunity, distressed areas, public housing projects across the United States, and they spent, together with private partners, about $17 billion trying to revitalize these areas. You can see a concrete example of that here in New Orleans, where you've got a housing development shown on the left before revitalization. It's quite distressed, very high rates of poverty, very high rates of crime. And then you can see how it looks after revitalization, obviously a clear physical change, but also a significant change in the set of families living in those areas, became more of a mixed income community, and so on. And so this program was implemented. There was a lot of controversy about it. Lots of people got displaced. They lost their community. Many people felt, why would you do this to make a lot of people move and then rebuild with more affluent folks living nearby? Does this really make sense? We've not really known, does this work or not? Recently, our team has been working on trying to study this with modern big data, following kids over time, trying to understand basically, if you were to grow up in a neighborhood that looks like the one on the left versus the one on the right, would it affect how your life looks down the road? And so in new work that's not yet publicly available, we'll be putting out later this year, we essentially, the simplified version is we track kids' outcomes over time, before versus after revitalization. So just to walk you through how this works, what we're doing here in each dot is taking a set of kids. If you look at that first dot there, it's the set of kids who are growing up in these public housing projects that were ultimately revitalized. We take the set of kids who lived there 10 years before it was revitalized, follow them over time, measure their earnings when they're about 30 years old, and we see in the tax data that those kids are making about $25,000 a year. So the same is true for kids who were growing up there 9 years before it was revitalized, 8 years before it was revitalized. Basically looks like a flat line, right? So then we can look at what happens after the neighborhood was revitalized. Same exact analysis. And you can see very clearly that the children who grew up in these exact same neighborhoods in low-income families receiving public assistance from the government for housing end up having significantly better outcomes afterward. They're earning about 15% more, about a $4,000 a year earnings gain for the kids who are growing up in the same places after revitalization. And so this again is an example of what is undoubtedly a very expensive investment upfront, $17 billion. But if you add up these $4,000 a year earnings gains year after year for so many kids who grow up in these projects, it more than pays for itself. This is again an incredibly high return investment. that ends up really transforming these communities. Now, we do further work, which I won't go into in great detail here, to understand the mechanism through which this is happening. Again, it seems like it's something about social interaction and social capital. Previously, you could think of these neighborhoods as being sort of like islands that were completely cut off from the surrounding areas. Lots of crime, lots of violence. Nobody wanted to kind of go into those neighborhoods. There was very little movement in and out. You can actually use cell phone data to measure where people are spending their time and look at interactions across neighborhoods. After this revitalization occurs, there's much more interaction across areas. You've sort of built a bridge between these communities and the surrounding areas, and that's why you see these large improvements in outcomes. So this shows you, this kind of place-based investment, which is actually, I think, being discussed here in Salt Lake City in the context of the west side of the city. It can really be transformative when done in the right way, when it creates those social connections. I want to spend the last few minutes here talking about higher education, which is obviously very relevant for where we're sitting today. And I think there's a lot that we can do in this space as well, using data, using scientific methods to improve the impacts of institutions like University of Utah on economic mobility. So just like our team has constructed statistics on economic mobility for every neighborhood in America, we've also constructed statistics on how every college in America contributes to economic mobility. When you think about colleges' contributions to economic mobility, there are two dimensions that matter. On the vertical axis is what we're calling the upward mobility rate. So think of this as among the set of kids who come from families in the bottom 20%, what fraction, when we follow them 10 years after college, end up reaching the top 20%. So you can see on that dimension, institutions like my own institution, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, et cetera, they look terrific. Many of the low-income kids who attend those colleges end up reaching the upper middle class or beyond. But of course, what matters for a college's contribution to economic mobility is not just how well the low-income kids you have on campus do, but how many low-income kids you have on campus to begin with. And that's what's shown on the horizontal axis. What that's measuring, what we're calling low-income access, is just the fraction of kids who come from low-income families. Again, as measured in tax data. This plot where every college is represented by a different dot is drawn using data on 30 million students who attended these colleges over the past 15 years or so. And so on that dimension of low-income access, you can see that places like Harvard and Yale and Stanford do not look very good. Only 3% of students come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And another statistic that kind of illustrates that issue is that you're about 80 times more likely to attend Harvard if you come from a family in the top 1% making more than $600,000 a year than a family in the bottom 20%. So these colleges end up educating a very small share of low-income kids, and so just mechanically cannot be contributing a whole lot to economic mobility. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you'll notice that there are a bunch of dots on the right side, typically two-year colleges, community colleges, that are educating many low-income kids, but unfortunately, you can see that they don't have great outcomes generally. Those dots are not very high. And so one way to conceptualize what the problem is in the higher education system in the US is that we basically have no dots in the upper right side of this chart. It's basically blank. You have very few colleges that both educate lots of low-income kids and have very good outcomes. Now you can see that same pattern plays out here in Utah. We've highlighted Utah colleges here. And you can see you have some institutions like University of Utah and BYU that deliver excellent outcomes. Many kids from low-income families end up doing quite well, but they have pretty limited access. Relatively few kids from low-income families attend these institutions. On the other hand, you have other colleges that do enroll more low-income kids, but the outcomes don't look so great. So I think a key question is what we can do moving forward to change this picture. And conceptually, there are really two ways you might try to tackle the problem. One is to take the dots that are on the right side here and move them up, try to improve outcomes at places like community colleges. The other is to take the dots that are up on the upper left and try to move them to the right, improve access to institutions like University of Utah, to places like Harvard and so on, to make them more accessible to kids from lower income backgrounds. So let's talk a little bit about how we can do each of those things. I think you can learn something from looking at the outliers on this plot. So let me highlight one that I think is illustrative. So up here, you have one dot that's way out in the upper right. It's kind of an exception to the rule. It's a place that both enrolls a lot of low-income kids and has pretty good outcomes. It's a place called the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology. It's a very small college in Queens, New York that does exactly what you'd think based on its name. It trains people in aeronautics and technology. Now, that's a career that pays pretty well. A bunch of low and middle income kids end up joining that college, and they end up having pretty good careers. And it illustrates something that I think is important to think about in the US, which we've traditionally not spent as much focus on, which is modern day vocational training. That's one way to think about what they're doing here. It's basically giving you specific skills that prepare you for a certain career that's gonna make you, reasonably well off. And that's something, as you all probably know, traditionally the US education system has been anchored around a liberal arts philosophy of training people in general rather than specific workforce skills like this. And so I think there's something to be said for at least parts of the population to doing something that looks more like vocational training that can be very effective. So to show you what that might look like, I want to give you one example that I think illustrates how this can be quite powerful. So there are increasingly a set of workforce training programs. This is an example called Year Up, that are showing very strong impacts in randomized trials on changing people's trajectories. So what these programs do is they give you a specific set of skills, could be like in IT or in financial operations, healthcare, something like that. And then they, again, give you what I would think of as a social capital element. They give you an internship at a specific firm. They give you a connection to an employer who wants to hire for that set of skills. And if all goes well, you might get a job at that firm like Bank of America or Citibank or something like that. So these programs appear quite effective. To show you that, here's some data from a randomized trial that was run in 2014, where you've got a set of folks who participated in this Year Up program in 2014. The treatment group, shown in the green, gets to participate in the program. The control group, shown in the orange, just by coin flip, doesn't get access to the program. We follow these folks' earnings over time, again, using tax records. Before 2014, those two lines look perfectly on top of each other, as you'd expect, because nothing has happened yet. In 2014, when the treatment group starts to participate in the program, their earnings fall because they're participating in the program rather than working, so they're starting to earn less. But then if you look at what happens right after 2014, you see this remarkable increase in earnings of about $9,000 per year in the treated group relative to the control group. Simply participating in this program for 1 year has completely put people on a different trajectory, earning about 35% more per year. So showing that this workforce approach can really have a strong causal effect. It's an element that we typically don't have in many of our community colleges, especially with this additional social capital support, and I think it's something that could really make a difference going forward. So that's one approach. So that's about how you might lift the dots on the right side up. So let's now talk about the other approach, how you might move the dots that are on the upper left to the right. So here again, I think modern data can be very useful in understanding what's going on. So one view you might have, you guys all applied to college, you might think we're applying when we're 18 years old or so. By that point, lots of disparities have emerged and have been baked in, right? So as I've been emphasizing, kids from lower income families, they've maybe gone to less advantaged schools, they've had different resources, they've been connected to different types of people. So it's very reasonable to ask, a place like University of Utah, which is a selective institution, is everything already sort of baked in by age 18? And there's really not that much you can do at that point if you're trying to get kids with a certain level of SAT scores, certain set of academic preparation, or is there actually something you can do in the college application and admissions process? And so to get at that, we've done some other work where we've linked everyone's SAT and ACT test score data to the tax records and to data on where everybody in America is going to college. And that allows us to draw graphs like this, which I think are very informative. So what we're doing here is taking a set of kids, all of whom have SAT scores exactly comparable to the current student body at the University of Utah. And what we're saying is, what we're looking at here is, what is your chance of attending the University of Utah versus your parents' income, holding fixed your SAT scores. So this is a set of kids, all of whom have the same level of academic preparation at the point that they're applying. So you can see, if you look at the far left, Kids from the lowest income families, they're 60% as likely as the average kid to attend the University of Utah with the same SAT scores. Kids on the far right, they're about 60% more likely, 1.6 times as likely as the average kid to attend the University of Utah with the same SAT scores. So putting those two extremes, comparing those two extremes, if you're from the richest families versus the poorest families, you're nearly 3 times as likely to attend the University of Utah, even when you're looking at kids with the exact same SAT scores. So that shows you that there's something we can do even at the college application stage to shift the dot for University of Utah over to the right without making a sacrifice in terms of academic credentials, right? So in particular, there are kids out there who are just as qualified as the kids currently here, in some sense, who could be attending this university, getting quite good outcomes, but are not doing so at the moment. And that's a place where we can make significant progress, maybe through outreach, getting those kids to apply, changing the admissions process, admitting them at higher rates, and so on. So I think there's a significant amount of progress that can be made there, both at the University of Utah and even more at other institutions. So here's the same plot for BYU, where the pattern's even more extreme, right? So a kid from a low-income family at BYU is only 30% as likely as the average kid to be attending the university, even with the same test scores, showing you that there's a real issue there in terms of lack of representation. That's not just about qualifications. Okay, so let me conclude with one final thought. So I've shown you a bunch of data on how economic opportunity varies across places, across institutions, how we can make progress on these issues in a very concrete scientific way. Why should we be interested in this? I think many of us are interested in these issues because we think that everyone should have a shot at the American dream, no matter the background, no matter where they grew up, et cetera. I think that kind of ideal runs deeply throughout this country and Utah in particular. But I also think there's another reason. If you just want to maximize growth and you just want to maximize total output and productivity, you should still be interested in the same set of issues. I'll show you one final set of data that illustrates that. So if you look at who goes on to become an inventor in America, here we've linked patent data to tax data, and look at who goes on to become an inventor as measured by having a patent. We can see that kids from high-income families on the right side of this chart are about 10 times more likely to go on to become inventors as kids from lower-income families. When we dig in and look at why that is, once again, it's because of who they're exposed to, the kinds of schools they attend, all the different things I've been talking about for the past half hour. And so the reason I think this is important is because when these kids come through the pipeline, if we were able to level this curve basically and bring more kids from lower income families through the innovation pipeline, not only would it give them better chances of upward mobility themselves, for them and their families, higher levels of income, but they would be discovering new drugs, starting new companies, creating more opportunities for the rest of us that would increase overall growth and benefit society as a whole. And so I see this as being an important issue of what we call lost Einsteins. There are lots of kids out there who could be doing very innovative things, but are kind of being lost because of our current societal structures. And so addressing some of the issues that I've been discussing here, I think matters not just from an equity or fairness perspective, but actually in terms of advancing the economy as a whole. And so, you might say, based on everything that I've shown you here, there's progress that we can make in terms of creating greater opportunity. It would increase growth and so on. But as I showed you at the very beginning, Utah looks pretty good on these metrics. It's pretty good it's among the best in terms of economic mobility. It is a place where you see lots of people starting successful businesses, going on to become inventors, and so on. And so you might have the view, like, do we really need to worry about this in the Utah context? Like, aren't we doing pretty well on this front? And I think at some level that's a reasonable reaction, but it's also important to recognize that none of this is like set in stone. These things can change over time, and as I'm sure many of you know, Utah is a state that is changing substantially over time, precisely because it's a place that's doing well. It's a place with very rapidly rising population. Lots of people want to move here. The racial demographics of the state are changing quite substantially as part of that. It's not totally clear that that means Utah will always remain a land of opportunity. And indeed, if you look at some indicators of the predictors of economic mobility that I was discussing earlier, You look at marriage rates, for example, the share of kids being raised in two-parent families, or you look at LDS church membership rates. So our sense is one of the reasons social capital and cross-class interaction is so high in Utah is because of the church. LDS church membership rates are declining, marriage rates are declining, society is changing in certain ways. All this suggests that it may not be for sure, it's not sort of a guarantee that Utah is always going to have the same high levels of economic opportunity. I think that will require deliberate efforts going forward to make sure that remains the case. And I very much hope that some of you will be interested in your own careers in studying these issues and continuing to contribute to keep Utah as a beacon of opportunity that others can look to and more generally make the American dream accessible to everyone. So I'll stop there and I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks.
All right, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. And as always, we'll prioritize student questions first. Just please state your name.
Hi, I'm Dylan. I'm a qual major. So on the when you were comparing Salt Lake City, the Salt Lake County economic areas, and then upward and middle between them, I saw a stark difference between. There was a stark divide between the street, and I was wondering, with that close proximity, what was causing the problems of upward mobility in between those two areas?
So you mean in this kind of map here?
Yes, in that kind of map. So right closer to the north end, right closer to Salt Lake City, there's a stark divide between that red area and that blue area, upper there. I was wondering, what was some of those problems there, or what was those
it's a great question. So let me answer that question at one level and then make a suggestion to you also. We, of course, don't have the bandwidth or the local knowledge to study every single neighborhood and know what's going on in this neighborhood versus that neighborhood. What I would say broadly when I've looked at the data for Salt Lake City is this very much reflects the broader patterns that I discussed analyzing the US data as a whole. So in general, the west side of the city tends to be more disconnected in terms of social capital. If you look at measures of school quality, you look at levels of segregation, all of those factors that I pointed out, they would all go in the direction of looking stronger in the blue-colored areas than the red-colored areas on this map. Now, that said, a very precise question about what is exactly going on in one neighborhood versus another, there's lots of local institutions and intricacies, like is the highway running through here? What kinds of businesses are located in this place or that place? We, as a research team based at Harvard, are not going to have the insight to know about every single place in the US or the local knowledge to do that. So one of the things we're hoping to do, and it's relevant for you all here, is all of this data is completely publicly accessible. You can go to this website and view it. You can download it. You can merge it to other things. Our team is able to assist with that. So if there are folks here who are interested in digging in deeper and to actually have a more precise answer to your question, that would, I think, be very fruitful.
It was right here.
Hi. So I am a graduate student and did my thesis paper on the importance of emotional intelligence in children and how it impacts their likelihood for success and also how it helps the economy. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to find a positive correlation that kids who have more emotional intelligence are more likely to succeed in both aspects. And so my question here is, I guess, how do you know the difference between the factors affecting the children, where obviously if they're in poverty, it's more likely that their parents also have less emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. And so instead of just uprooting them and bringing them to a higher successful area, how do you create the disruption in that cycle for parents to have more emotional intelligence so that their kids can have more emotional intelligence?
Yeah, it's a great question. I certainly think emotional intelligence, sometimes economists use the term non-cognitive skills, those kinds of things can be extremely important in driving the patterns that we're seeing. The way I would interpret some of what I'm showing you here is that is determined not just by your parents and your family, but also the broader community context. That's what we're finding in many different settings, that kids who go to certain schools, who are in different communities, end up developing not just different cognitive skills and SAT scores, but different non-cognitive skills as well. And that may well be more important than the cognitive skills ultimately in their life outcomes. Now, the question you asked basically is, rather than uprooting folks, which is the moving to opportunity approach I described, what can you do to transform these places? I think the Hope 6 program that I described is one thing that appears to have effectively done that. There are other things that you can do in schools. So there are certain types of charter schools that have shown to be quite effective. We've done work looking at the long-term impacts of teachers. If you happen to get lucky and have a very good teacher in kindergarten, we link that to your earnings data 25 years later and show that that has very significant impact. So we can try to change the quality of the teaching workforce, which doesn't require moving families across areas. There are also family-level interventions, which I think it's a little bit less clear what works there, but things like the nurse-family partnership and other programs that try to change parenting directly. My read is that the evidence is either more preliminary or more mixed on that relative to the neighborhood school level stuff, but that's another angle that could also be relevant.
All right, we have time for one question. We'll go right here.
Hi, my name is Evelyn. I'm a freshman here at the University of Utah. You kind of cited Utah as a land of opportunity and a good place to pursue the American dream. I was just wondering how Utah's recent DEI legislation, which impacts higher education centers dedicated to advising and supporting minority students, how that would influence the economic mobility of these students and even affect the odds of these minority students ascending college in Utah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing I did not have time to focus on in depth here is how economic opportunity varies by race and ethnicity. And that's another dimension of the data that you can look at. If you go to the Opportunity Atlas, you can cut the data. You can look at the data for white kids, for black kids, for Hispanic kids, and see how outcomes vary. In a nutshell, what you find is even conditional on parent income, there are really big differences in economic mobility by race and ethnicity. Black kids and black boys in particular are much less likely to rise up than white boys growing up in families at the exact same income level. And so then the question is, given that fact, what's driving those disparities and what can we do about it? And my view is that the same kind of set of factors of who you're connected to, who you're influenced by, what those communities look like, starting at very early ages is extremely important in determining these trajectories. And so I think continuing to think carefully about what kinds of investments we can make in those communities to create opportunity, not just in the higher education space, but I would argue going all the way back to childhood, is extremely important, both because it can expand opportunities for those groups, but as I was emphasizing, just make the overall economy more productive. And so I think continuing to focus on that strikes me as quite important.
All right, unfortunately, we are out of time. Dr. Chetty has his next engagement to get to right at 1 o'clock. So please join me in thanking him for today's discussion.